Ollie, how deep are the divisions within the G7 at this point?
So opinions differ, but the headline is the same across the G7 and many nations, which is this is not our war. This is not something that the Europeans or many of the other G7 members are willing to take a kinetic or active military role in. It's something that we've heard the Trump administration call for periodically, not in a very specific manner, but basically trying to get the help from some of these allies to reopen the Straits of Hormuz. And the answer across the board has been we do not have appetite to do so. And in normal circumstances, a G7 meeting might be a place for leaders and for foreign ministers to discuss potentially coordinated action, potentially, let's say, on oil strategic reserves. We're not in ordinary times. So for many of the people that are here, the foreign ministers of the G7 and the wider group, it will really be a fact-finding mission for conversations with the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who arrives here tomorrow. They will be trying to figure out what the U.S. war aims are, how they see the war developing, what the next steps are, and of course trying to keep the United States on side on a number of key issues for the Europeans, including Ukraine, potentially putting forward some of the reporting we've seen recently about the Russians sharing intelligence with the Iranians, sharing potentially drones and hardware. That will be the message that the Europeans are pushing. But I think here also there's going to be a degree of conversation among G7 allies on where exactly they stand and what help they can provide to the United States and what help the United States is actually asking for concretely.
Well, yes, we're more than a year into President Trump's second term, Ollie. Is the G7 still a relevant format?
I think that's a very valid question. I think that for the last year, the Trump administration has effectively been trying to invalidate structures like the G7 of multilateralism. And if you think back at the origin of what the G7 is, and really the echoes of history here are really sort of bizarre to consider, that the first G6 meeting was held in Rambouillet, not far from here, and it was to deal with two major crises across the globe. One was the collapse, basically, of the international monetary order, Bretton Woods, and then the second was an oil crisis instigated by OPEC blockading countries that support Israel. Fast forward 50 years, we're dealing with many of the same issues here. The difference is that back then, the communique, the Declaration of Rambouillet, the antidote to many of these issues was more open trade, more multilateralism, more cooperation among nations to sort of grow the economy across the world. And now we have a Trump administration giving the exact opposite direction. So really, I think it's interesting to come back to the place of birth of the old international economic architecture to find out if it is still valid or if it's here that we bury it.
Ollie, on that point, how do we expect Marco Rubio to approach this meeting? He's seen typically as being more in the form of a traditional diplomat, the US's chief diplomat, versus a J.D. Vance, for example. But have the dynamics changed? How do we expect Rubio's relationship to play out in the coming days with his counterparts?
Well, I think where the Europeans and a lot of in the international community rely on Marco Rubio is to bring kind of substance and also detail to some of the sort of broad strokes that we get from the Trump administration. So I think for many ministers who will be carrying meetings with Marco Rubio, again, it's trying to find those facts to get a clear idea, A, of what the war aims are of the United States, how they're going to achieve those, though it's probably not terribly likely that they'll give too much information on that, given that none of the G7 were really alerted to this invasion before it happened. But again, I think also getting a clear idea of what kinds of things, what kinds of support the G7 can lend to the United States, potentially in the day after, in order to win back the United States on side. And again, I think that for the Europeans, the absolute colossal point here is going to be keeping the Ukrainians on the agenda. We should say that the Ukrainian foreign minister will also be present in these talks and talking to G7 foreign ministers.